I'd be really interested to talk to Chase about our human relationship with animals. I don't mean to be queuing you up for that one, Dan, but I'm curious to get into it.
Oh,
Chase,
yeah.
what do you got for us?
Let's do it. Hey, Chase, you're on Truth Wanted. What's going on?
Hey, doing well, folks. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for your activism with human rights. You know, I donated to the Doctors Without Borders tonight, so thank you very much for putting that up.
Thank you, Chase.
Thank
you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Right on. So, yes, I'd like to get your thoughts on animal rights. I recently celebrated my 15-year anniversary of not eating animals, and I feel really good about it. I got to hang out with a rescued pig recently, and she was really friendly, but the standard practice in the meat industry is to kill them when they're only 6 months old. And, you know, that's pretty sad to me, you know, so I'm just wondering
Sure.
if you guys have any thoughts or questions about veganism. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, can you narrow it down for us at all? It's pretty broad for us all to just be like, well, here is what I think about veganism. You know, as a mental health professional, my qualifications here are, I don't know that I have I mean, I actually have a lot of thoughts on this, but can you help me out a little bit?
Yeah, I can narrow it down to, you know, like most people don't know, just like I didn't know that these animals are killed when they're really young, you know. So 6 months old for pigs, that's, you know, like killing a puppy to me, you know. And you know, 5 weeks old for chickens, 18 months old for cows usually, you know. So for meat at least. And so I'm just you know, thinking, you know, if we care about animals, if we claim to be wanting compassion for animals like dogs and cats, you know, why should we limit that compassion to just those animals instead of expanding that circle of compassion to as many creatures as we can, as often as we can? And I just don't think that it's compassionate to kill a young animal.
I hear that. And I think you and I are probably pretty well aligned. I'll acknowledge absolutely that like my partner and I do eat meat and we consume dairy and some of these things. But that notion of talking about like baby animals versus full grown animals, I have to kind of wonder why it matters or how it matters. I can certainly acknowledge that it pulls on our heartstrings. And I think that that's important. And it kind of raises the question of like, what is it? You know, what is a pig to a human and how ought a human relate to a pig? And I think that we kind of have to get a little bit on the same page, maybe not every member of our society, but as a culture, we kind of need to grapple with the fact that we are these creatures that have been historically designed or programmed or evolved. I mean, I think there's probably better language here. We have evolved to consume these creatures. We don't necessarily need to, but how do we define our relationship with them? The young ones versus the old ones, I guess I'm struggling to see philosophically why that would be significantly different. Can you help me out there?
Yeah, thank you for letting me clarify it once again. So let's contrast this to what I did with my dog when he got really old and sick, and you know, I gave him a mercy killing, a euthanasia. You know, gave him I took him to the veterinarian, and we peacefully put him down. That was in his best interest. I would want someone to do the same for me if I was in a bad spot like that. You know, but that's different than killing an animal who has not. Whether they're a baby animal or they're in their prime of like 3 or 5 years old, or if they're 10 years old, if their lifespan still has a few more years in it, I think we should let them enjoy that for as long as they can.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up the question of like, is it ethical to raise a creature exclusively for the eventual, you know, destruction of that creature? To me, again, it still kind of doesn't matter how long you do it for if that is the ultimate end. Otherwise, we're kind of just playing this game of like, well, some of your life will be for us humans and some of your life will be lived for you yourself. And that again gets into kind of tricky philosophical territory. Am I off base here? Do either of y'all see some holes in that argument?
Listen, we all know I'm the vegan in this room. Okay, so I'll give my piece. Okay, so listen, you know, Chase, the kind of questions you're asking me now, or you're asking the panel now, is of course the reason why I'm vegan today, because I realized I didn't have a good answer to this. And it was actually by callers from Truth Wanted in part who really challenged me on this. And I came to some really interesting conclusions. A book I talk about a lot is Melanie Joy's Why We Love, God, I always get this title is crazy title. It's Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. Okay. And she's a psychologist, and she comes up with this idea of carnism. Right. And carnism is sort of this idea of, look, we kind of have this unseen hierarchy of animals, that some that we deem okay for food, okay for consumption, some we deem for veneration and for protection. So the great example of this, right? If I show a video of me eating a dog on Facebook, people are going to be outraged, rightfully so, right? It's like there's no real reason for me to do that, right? Because like it's not harming anything, it's kind of living its life. But if I'm shocking a cow, if I'm prodding a cow for it to go up to line up for slaughter, we don't tend to have that same reaction, even though ostensibly cows and dogs are similar enough to where they have like similar experiences of pain, right? Like, I don't think that they're so fundamentally different that, you know, somehow cows don't feel electric shocks. They certainly do, right? For at least from my understanding, maybe Forrest can tell me otherwise. But, you know, the point is we do have a sort of a different hierarchy of animals, and it's a cultural bias that happens in different parts of the world, right? In India, it's very well known that cows are venerated. They don't treat cows the same way that Americans view cows, as just, you know, animals that are ready for our consumption. And so like the conclusion I come to is, well, if there's a being that's going to have an ability to feel, right, if it has a capacity to suffer, I think it's worthy of our moral consideration, and should otherwise be we should otherwise be expanding, as you put it rightfully so, our circle of compassion. The same way that, like, I know that people of other races, people of other genders of mine also suffer, even though they are not like me. I want to expand my circle of moral consideration. We should be doing the same for non-human animals as well. It's a pretty radical conclusion. Most people don't do that. It's still pretty nascent idea. It's a nascent idea even amongst progressive people. I still get made fun of by my friends who say, hey, this is silly and it's not worth pursuing. But I do think, at least in my understanding of what's right and what's wrong, it's me trying to justify, or not justify, but try to be more consistent in my idea of what I think is right and wrong. And that's ultimately why I'm a vegan. It's really trying to sort of right what I think has been a historical injustice towards beings who have a capacity to suffer. So there you go. That's my long ass vegan rant. There you go, Chase. You got it. You got it from me.
Which, you know, for me is just why I feel like when we kind of descend into the particulars, the notion of, you know, puppies versus adult dogs, or, you know, suckling pigs, and like all of that starts to fall apart for me just a little bit. But Chase, I didn't mean to butt in here. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
Or Forrest too. Forrest, if you, because I haven't heard from you on this yet. I want to make sure you have
I have some thoughts, but you just spoke for a minute. I want to let Chase respond to what you said first.
Sure.
Even if it is just like, yeah, totally.
I'm interested in. I'd like to hear Forrest's thoughts on it.
Yeah. So I think so I am also not a vegan. I think there's a few things that can definitely be said about you know, meat eating. There are some definite criticisms to and worthy criticisms to the way that we handle and produce and utilize meat in our culture. So like the way that we treat animals in factory farming, I don't think there's any argument that it's horrific and we need to do better. The impact on the climate, I don't think there's any argument that that's a major issue and we need to be doing better about that. The sheer amount of meat that we require in our diet as a cultural preference is pretty extreme on a global standard. And like, that's something that I think we can all agree we need to do better on. The suffering of sentient beings, I think that falls under, like, when we talk about factory farming could be better. So like there are a few things that I think are definite worthy criticisms of meat eating, especially in the context of our specific culture, that I think can be improved. And should be improved. However, I don't think that it's fair to then make the argument that we should completely eliminate it. Not that we can't. sure, you can totally, but that we ought to, I think, is a bit of a stretch. Meat eating is a part of a healthy diet. It plays a huge role in our own evolutionary history. We would not be the way that we are today if we were not eating meat. That doesn't make it right, but it does mean that our bodies are more or less adapted for it still, and we do get a significant benefit from it. And to just point to the age of an animal to say, well, this animal is young and therefore it is. I think
Chase was using that to illustrate a point. I don't know if he's
I think so too. I think so too. But I just want to I'm drawing it to an absurd conclusion to point out the fact that it's difficult to really hunker down on this idea of contrasting the length of life versus the quality of life. These aren't qualities that are inversely proportional. We can't say that the longer an animal lives, or if it lives a little bit of time, that means that it's worse off, and it could have been better if it was longer, and that one goes up and the other goes down, and things like, I think at the end of the day, if we were treating the animals that we were eating better, not putting them in the conditions that they were in, not like doing these crazy soulless factory farms, and we were producing and distributing meat more ethically, we wouldn't have half of the problems that we have today with any of this. And that's just my thought on it.
Can I challenge you, Forrest? Can I challenge you?
I hope you do.
Do you think Chase is unhealthy?
No. I think that in our modern society, we have ways to supplement the kind of things like, for example, the amino acids that we need to get from meat.
Okay. Because you said it's it's not healthy to eat. I thought you were saying it wasn't healthy to not eat meat.
No, forgive me. I must have Yeah, I wasn't very clear then. No, it is a normal part of a healthy diet in a wild setting. For us now, we can supplement on some things.
We're 100% on the same page, because I thought you were saying it, and I was like, I'm a challenge on that. Well, I agree. Right. Even in order to be vegan,
pea protein, bro,
to do it right, you do. I think supplements are like super important, right? Like
very important.
I'm definitely like there are proteins that are easier and amino acids. I don't want to get into the specifics, but it's easier to do it with meat than you do with other things. One of the things I talk about is B12, right? B12 naturally occurs like in dirt and stuff, and like B12 is they talk about deficiencies, and that truth is most Americans are, there's more deficiency in the general American population as well, not just like with vegans, but that's something that can happen when you're switching, eating from animal products, right? So anyway, I don't know. There you go. We're on the same page then, therefore. So that's good, because that was the one thing I heard. I was like, wait, does he want?
Well, and like the thing is, even with the B12 thing, like you have to try to run out of B12. B12 is an extremely important nutrient. You will die weirdly without it. And for that reason, your liver stores like almost 5 years worth of it just on hand at all times. So like you have to really fuck up to run out of B12.
You can get fortified cereal with B12. Like B12 isn't a lot.
Exactly. There's a million ways to get it. And so like, there are ways to change it around now, but you do have to make these accommodations. And like, I think it's also important to point out, again, this is a little bit of argument ad absurdum, but no, not quite. But like there are some extremes to it that are worthy of consideration as well. For example, the most common replacements for meat protein, if I remember right, are like wheat, soy, and nuts, right? And like these are also the most common food allergies. And so there's an issue there where either you're putting people at risk by doing this, or they're going to have to spend more money to get an even weirder kind of protein. Vegan food is not always cheap, because you're having to go out and getting this kind of off, unfamiliar, uncommon protein. Another thing is that, when you are doing something like, you want a bunch of quinoa or whatever it is, well, that's a staple crop for this indigenous population down here that you're now exploiting. You're having to build a bunch of it. And like, that's now a bunch more farming land that you're taking up. That's now a bunch more habitat destruction that you're doing. That's not, there's a bunch of issues there as well. It's not always economical. Like I said, vegan food tends to be expensive if you want something that's decent. If you want to go out and buy, whatever, fruits, vegetables, potato chips, whatever, I'm sure you can come up with an economical vegan diet. but it would take a pretty significant overhaul of a normal, or I shouldn't say normal, of like a typical meat eating lifestyle that not a lot of people can afford. A lot of people live in food deserts where they don't have access to fresh produce. That's not available to them. That's not a possibility. They don't want to just eat potato chips all day because that's the only vegan option that they have that's non-perishable. You know what I mean? So like, there's a lot of considerations there. And I think it's important to point out that it's not just something that you can just, everybody can just do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts that, but Chase, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm mostly, I'm mostly aiming at folks that can actually do this. You know, I'm not trying to like get homeless people to go vegan if they can't do it. You know, so there are some homeless vegans, and it's impressive to see. But you know,
wild.
Easier said than done. You know, and easier in places like California, like Los Angeles or Berkeley and stuff like that. But in any case. You know, vegans, there's a lot of meta-analysis and RCTs about how vegans have reduced risk of cancer and heart disease and type 2 diabetes, and that vegan diets are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, from pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, elderly, and for athletes. And then the last thing I'll say about, in response to what you had said, was about price. So there's a study from the University of Oxford, the global study of 150 different countries, showing that, especially in countries like ours, in developed nations, the vegan diet is on average 30% cheaper, because it's usually, you know, a lot of rice and pasta, fruits, vegetables, seeds, beans, bread. And then, yeah, you know, it's true though that some vegan food is more expensive right now, like some of the vegan meats or vegan milks, and vegan cheeses and ice cream and stuff. But that's just because those products are new to the market, and as more people buy them, supply and demand will change. And if we stop giving tax subsidies from the government going to animal agriculture, but instead put that into plant-based products, that will drive that price down further as well. But
that's an interesting argument. Yeah. And like, I think that I'm going to look up the studies you talked about. That's interesting. I certainly wouldn't begrudge anybody doing it. My issue is always just when it's like an all or nothing game.
And the prescriptive nature of it.
Yeah. I think that there is no argument to be made that the meat industry sucks the way it is. It needs to be better. And the amount of meat consumption sucks the way it is, and it needs to be less. I don't think there's any argument for that. Going all the way into...
I'm sorry. Just when I said at the beginning that I think Chase and I likely aligned on a lot of things, that's sort of the perspective that I'm coming at it from. Like I'm a meat eater, but like a Michael Pollan, Temple Grandin type thinker in terms of, we need to be eating less of it. We need to be more responsible in the way that we do it. And that's why I was hoping that we could have more of a conversation about just humanity's relationship with these creatures and what our responsibilities are there. And I appreciate that we did get sort of like the broad TED talk on why veganism makes sense. And I'm not philosophically opposed, even if, there are some logistical issues before we get there. But I understand we lost Chase in all of this.
Yeah.
Let
me say this, because I got okay. So when I started going vegan, I was making $40K a year. Okay. This is a very common idea. I understand food deserts exist. People have allergies. Absolutely. I think this is a very common sentiment, and I thought this too before I went vegan. Isn't it expensive? Isn't it always not accessible? Absolutely. There's going to be issues. The problem is I live in Austin, Texas, and I know, and most people watching this show, like when we're talking about means of access, it is definitely more accessible than I think a lot of people portray it as well. I think like there's another side to this conversation, because meat is the most, we live in the most meat subsidized country in the world, where meat is the cheapest here pretty much than anywhere else. Australia is like number 2 on that, right? It's like, we're used to meat being as accessible as it is, when the truth is, in developing nations, in other places, it is the non-meat options that are going to be more affordable. So like, I'm glad Chase brought that up, because that study is right. For the global population outside of America, it is way more accessible to have non-meat options for your
You know,
proteins. Yeah.
It's interesting to frame it that way, because like one of my things was like, okay, well, this, if you're talking about accessibility with the emphasis being on the compassion for these people that it is not accessible to, flipping that to a global perspective is a really good counter argument, because then you're saying, okay, well, there's billions of people in India or and this side of the world, and that you're now talking about with the exact same thing. You want them to go carnivore. You want them to eat meat. Do you understand how expensive and difficult that is? How crazy.
Right. Exactly.
If I'm talking about wheat and soy and peanut allergies, do you know how many people have alpha-gal syndrome that are allergic to meat? You want them to try to go out there and get a hamburger? What's wrong with you? You know what I mean? You can make the exact same argument flipped on its head, and it would be just as reasonable.
Yeah, I think so. And it's like, to me, it's like, I compare it to almost like working out, almost like taking care of your body and stuff, right? Like, yeah, not everybody can do that. People have disabilities, and it's hard. It's just hard, you know, for most of us, but it doesn't mean it's not
Especially
a good thing to do, right? And it's just like, you know, and there may be, and some other vegans argue this, that we might have a compulsion or a moral necessity or obligation to do it. One example I've heard of this, and this is a very, again, radical argument, but it's something that gives me pause, is we used to be a country that, you know, enslaved, I mean, we still have slaves, but like, you know, it was more of a phenomenon, right? It was more of a publicly accessible good, right? And and most people today would say, hey, we shouldn't be doing that, right? Yeah. We need to stop that. Well, the truth is, you know what happened we had a whole reconstruction in this country because our economy was so dependent on slavery, right? There were real ramifications of that. People did lose their livelihoods. Entire industries were changed. All kinds of impacts were happening on people. But all of us would say, right, like, yeah, that was necessary because we had to do something, right? And so, like, I think there's something you could say with veganism, because, yeah, if we absolutely disrupted animal agriculture and did all these things and changed people the way they eat and stuff, yeah, it would disrupt a lot of things. But maybe it is something that we have to do if we're going to have to make the most positive change and most positive impact. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense.